Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, both in this room and those who are watching online. Like many of you, I came here via Whitehall, and for a moment I thought the numbers were going to be even dramatically larger than they are. But this is one of probably our largest ever meeting. As I saw all the people campaigning for the farming interest, I couldn't help but remember that Michael would have had a very strong interest in this matter, not only because of his own farming background, but when I was Secretary of State for Scotland, he was my minister who dealt with environmental issues. And there was a drama in Islay, the island of Islay off the west coast of Scotland, when the farmers, there was a plague of greylag geese, and the farmers, not surprisingly, wanted them all shot, and the RSPB wanted them all saved. And there was huge friction, and I sent Michael to see if he could sort out some sort of compromise. And he did. He came back, and as he entered my room, he was waving a piece of paper saying, "Geese in our time." This is, of course, more than just a meeting, but the numbers today are vast for two reasons: the quality of our speaker, John Sawers, who I will come to in a few moments, but it's also, I think, for most of us, if not indeed all of us, it's also an opportunity to remember and pay tribute to Michael. And I'm delighted in particular that his daughters, Claire and Mary, are with us today. You know, I was actually with Michael when he first conceived it. It wasn't my idea, it was his idea entirely. This goes back to 2006, 18 years ago. We were both members of Parliament at the time, and he asked me to have a chat with him one day. And he said, "You know, I'm thinking of trying to create a forum for strategic discussion, to encourage strategy." His concern then, as it was over the years, was that governments and Parliament and politicians didn't give enough time thinking of future challenges and how they could be anticipated and perhaps dealt with more effectively. And so GSF was effectively born that day by Michael. It wouldn't have happened without him. And he's been a tower of strength ever since, until his sad demise just very recently. I want also at this moment, for a very obvious reason, to pay particular tribute also to Jacqueline Jinks. They really did work as a team throughout, and I saw that at first hand so often. And of course, since Michael's death, Jacqueline has carried the burden not only of today, but of the determination to continue the existing program that Michael had in mind over the last few months. And there will therefore be future events determined on that basis. Michael's main priority was to make his own contribution to these great political and strategic issues. We served in government, as I mentioned a few moments ago. Sadly, he never was a cabinet minister. There's a lot of arbitrary luck and bad luck in politics. He would have been a cabinet minister, I have not the slightest doubt about it. But sadly, in 1987, he lost his seat at the general election. Only for 5 years he was out of Parliament. But when he came back, he became Minister of State in the Department of Northern Ireland. And there, you know, he may not have been a cabinet minister, but he was a statesman of very high order, and a statesman as impressive as any cabinet minister, and more impressive than some have been. And his contribution in Northern Ireland was so typical of the man, because it was at the time when the IRA had said, "We are willing to give up the armed struggle." And of course, a lot of doubt as to whether they meant it. And Michael, with great personal courage, was involved in very private discussions with the leaders of the IRA or of Sinn Féin, and was part of that process which ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement. So we're talking about someone who was political, who was parliamentary, but was a statesman in the best sense of the word, that he devoted his life to making whatever contribution he could to these matters. So let us now turn to the events of today. And you know, Michael actually planned this meeting. Not the precise date of it, but the Speaker as well, as the fact of it. Because months ago, earlier this year, much earlier this year, he said, you know, we're going to have an American presidential election, and whatever the outcome, it's going to be very, very important that we have an analysis of its implications, whoever wins. And of course, with the Trump re-election, that has become crucially important. Before I say a very few words about John, can I just make a couple of, as it were, housekeeping points? I mentioned this as an online meeting as well, and therefore for those attending this event remotely via Zoom, they can only view, they cannot speak, but they can see what is happening. For any online audience members who would like to ask a question, they should submit it in writing through the question and answer function that they, I understand, have available. And I will choose to ensure that there are contributions online as well as from those present. Can I just end up these comments by saying the event will be recorded, and that is right and proper. So I turn very briefly, because I don't want to take up more time than I can possibly not avoid, to John Sawers, who many of you will have heard of, and you will know, so I'm not going to go through biographical details in any length. He served in MI6 for many years and eventually was the chief of MI6 for some 6 years. But he was also an ambassador both to Egypt and to the United Nations. He was an advisor to successive ministers and prime ministers. And I recall when I chaired the Intelligence and Security Committee and John was chief of MI6, I saw at first hand the sheer quality and professionalism that he represents. So without any further ado, John, I now invite you to address us.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here at the first meeting of the Global Strategy Forum without Michael. I knew Michael a bit because when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, he came and visited me first in Cairo, and we put him up in opulent surroundings there, and then in Baghdad, where it was rather more basic, in the summer of 2003 when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary. And he was the most impeccable and valuable and thoughtful and considerate visitor. And I agree with you, Malcolm, his biggest contribution was to the Northern Ireland peace process, where he laid the basis for what eventually was a settlement of the Troubles. He was truly one of the nicest and most gentlemanly people I met in politics. So, what of Donald Trump's election? Does it mark the end of the era of liberal democracy in America? The New Statesman reminded us this weekend that Henry Kissinger remarked about 6 years ago that Donald Trump may be one of those figures in history who appear from time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretenses. Now, some of us used to console American friends in 2016 after Trump was first elected that we said Brexit's forever, but Trump's only for 4 years. It seems like Trump is more enduring. We may be having buyer's remorse after our populist moment 8 years ago, but the Americans have doubled down on theirs. We won't know for some time if this is the end of an old era and the start of a new one. The last two Zeitenwende, as Chancellor Scholz called it, were in 1945 and 1989. And it was very apparent very quickly that it was the end of an era. Even then, instant historians like Frank Fukuyama got it wrong. I was very struck reading Anne Applebaum's excellent book, Autocracy, Inc., that in the 1990s, she wrote, everyone assumed that in a more open, interconnected world, democracy and liberal ideas would gradually spread to the autocratic states. Nobody, she said, nobody imagined that autocracy and illiberalism would instead spread to the democratic world. And she hits the nail on the head. This assault on our worldview has taken us by surprise. Our liberal democracy, underpinned by a market economy and the rule of law, which we fought to defend in World War II and through the Cold War, is now under a more insidious threat. And Trump's re-election is a dark warning. Illiberal democracy isn't confined to countries like Turkey, Hungary, and India. We shall soon see if extremist groups in Germany do well enough to force themselves into national government, as their counterparts in the Netherlands have done. Or will a share of power moderate the policies of far-right parties as it has in Italy? What surprise does the 2027 presidential election in France hold for us? Is the rise of the extreme left even more worrying than the rise of the far right? Who and what will succeed Trump in 2028? All these are very worrying questions, and the answers will determine whether we are seeing a Gramsci-style end of an era with all the morbid symptoms that go with it, or if it is more of a painful correction against excessive liberalism after which the old order returns. But on Donald Trump himself, how much of his agenda, which we've heard so much about, be implemented in practice? Leave the domestic side to one side just for now, but I think Trump's view of the world is defined by 4 strongly held opinions. I was going to say convictions, but that means something else in the Trump lexicon. First of all, Donald Trump believes that other countries have taken advantage of the United States to secure their defense and prosperity without paying their way. Second, he does not believe that America should be the world's policeman. He doesn't like wars, and he will do what he can to keep America out of them. Third, he does not believe in free trade, and he thinks, with some good reason, that free trade has led to industry leaving America, harming American workers. He's going to instead pursue a policy designed to bring industry back to America. And fourthly, he believes, this time with little evidence, that tariffs are the best weapon in America's armory to force other countries to do what America wants. Now, the markets have been buoyed by Trump's election. They see in his promise of tax cuts and deregulation a bonanza for American business. I wonder if that is premature. I think Trump's commitment to cut taxes, impose tariffs on imports, and to deport low-cost migrant labor will all add to inflation. Of course, he won't bring all these policies in at once. Some of them are designed merely to get foreign powers to the negotiating table so he can extract concessions from them. But there are unresolved contradictions in Trump's economic policy. And James Carville famously said back in the Clinton era that if he was to return to this world in another guise, he will want to come back as the bond market, because nothing is more powerful. And the Trump administration may learn that lesson in the coming years. US debt is 125% of GDP now. It will probably be 150% of GDP, America's GDP, by the time Trump has finished his term. A debt crisis is a real possibility during Trump's second term, and a confrontation with the Federal Reserve over interest rates is a near certainty. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm not an economist. I am or was a practitioner in international affairs. So what should we expect of Trump administration in the world of conflicts we now live in? Ukraine seems to be the first issue. I doubt Trump will decide on his peace initiative until his administration is in place, and given all the wacky nominations we've been reading about, it may take some time to achieve that. Already we know that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio have very different views on what to concede to Moscow in order to bring peace to Ukraine. One thing I think we can reckon on is that Trump won't want his first foreign policy decision to be seen as an act of weakness and to colour his administration's record in the way that Biden's scuttle and run from Afghanistan has done to his. Whatever Trump comes up with, Putin will have to be persuaded that the war is to come to an end. Putin will demand that Ukraine is excluded from NATO, and he will demand that some sanctions at least are lifted for Russia. And there's no doubt that Trump will look to Europe to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. It's not a great outlook. But all that said, I think President Zelensky is right to be making the most of the disruption that Trump's election will bring. Ukraine is not doing well in this war. It's not going to regain its territory by military means, even with the US administration's latest move on tactical missile use. I doubt there'll be a formal peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia, but who knows? But I do think there is a chance to end the conflict in 2025, at least to have a cessation of hostilities and a separation of forces, and Trump's election actually improves those prospects. Chancellor Scholz reaching out to Putin is largely for German political reasons, with his election coming up in the new year, but it is a sign of a wider desire for the war to end. Now, Zelensky wants to have a Polish-type solution of secure boundaries and embedded in the EU and NATO. Putin probably wants a Georgia-style solution where the occupation of some of the country's territory subjugates the whole of the country to Moscow's will. All of us here are familiar with Finland's history, the brave war fought against Stalin's invading forces, the imposed peace conceding 11% of Finland's territory to the Soviet Union, the appeasing compromise of Finlandization to keep the Soviet Union at bay after World War II. Such a deal would be a bitter pill for the Ukrainians to swallow. But if Ukraine can manage its future relations with Moscow as well as Finland has done over the last 80 years, that may be the best available outcome. On China, we should expect Trump not just to talk tough, but to introduce some of these high tariffs that he's threatening. President Xi will retaliate, and in parallel will increase the pressure on Taiwan. As I said earlier, Donald Trump doesn't like war, and Taiwan is not, in his view, a vital US national interest. So I can't see Donald Trump deploying US forces to defend Taiwan if it comes to a fight. Xi Jinping may have the same assessment, which might encourage him to take risks, especially if his many problems at home worsen, challenging the Communist Party's control. I think the chances of a Taiwan crisis in the next 4 years have gone up with Trump's election. There was some stability under Biden and a clear dialogue between Washington and Beijing, setting out each other's red lines. But even if Xi does think he has a historic opportunity to reabsorb Taiwan into the mainland, I think he will feel his way forward. He knows that even a successful blockade of Taiwan will take time and provoke Western sanctions, which the Chinese economy can ill afford. And President Trump's tone on China is going to be important. In the third conflict zone, the Middle East, Trump will want Netanyahu to do as much damage as he can to Hezbollah and Hamas in the next 10 weeks, and then bring the fighting to an end. Hamas triggered the latest crisis, the crisis of the last year, but Israeli forces have turned the tables on their enemies, and Gaza is now a wasteland. I have deep concerns about Israeli intentions towards the West Bank and Gaza. We are likely to see further annexations of Palestinian land and more Palestinians forced to leave. Already, over 5% of Gaza's population have left for Egypt, and another 2 or 3% have been killed in the Israeli assault. So this is an ugly outlook, but I don't expect the Trump administration to care very much about the Palestinians. The bigger challenge in the region is Iran. I have no idea what Elon Musk might have said to the Iranian ambassador in New York when they met recently, but judging from what President-elect Trump's nominees have said, there will be support across the new administration for an Iran policy of total pressure. And Trump's grievance against Iran will have been deepened by the FBI evidence that the Iranians plotted to kill Trump during the campaign, presumably a response in their minds to his decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Either way, this is personal. The first move, I think, will be to reinforce sanctions, including on Iranian oil exports, which the Biden administration unwisely allowed to grow. But Netanyahu has his eye on the opportunity to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities and the nuclear weapons program, which we know from intelligence the Iranians still have as their goal. But to do that, to destroy those nuclear facilities, he needs direct US military involvement, because only the Americans have the ordnance and the reach to destroy facilities deep under rock and concrete. The Trump-Netanyahu relationship has had its difficult moments. Bibi pulling out of the Soleimani assassination at the last minute and his quick endorsement of Biden's election later that year both angered Trump. But the idea of doing permanent damage to Iran's nuclear weapons program at a time when the Iranian regime is weak and vulnerable will be tempting for the US president. As well as concerns over democratic values and conflict, there are 3 other issues I would just highlight as problems that a Trump administration will make more intractable. The first is climate change. I don't see any figure in the Trump circle who is concerned at our rapidly changing climate. Trump himself isn't a climate denier, but he doesn't accept that the United States has a role in limiting the extent of climate change or helping developing countries adapt to it. The world has already passed the 1.5 degrees target limit set at the Paris COP, and we're now marching towards 3 degrees by the end of the century. Are we going to see no action from the United States for the next 4 years? Second, trade. Tariffs are Trump's weapon of choice. The World Trade Organization was neutered in his first term when Trump blocked the disputes recognition procedure, and Biden did nothing to reverse that. We don't yet know how aggressively the new administration will move on trade tariffs, but there is no longer even an aspiration for free trade, probably the biggest driver of global growth in the last 40 years. Less trade means poorer people. And third, the United Nations, where, as Malcolm said, I served as the UK ambassador. The political UN, the Security Council and so on, has been undermined by the great power rivalry that is the main feature of today's world. The very design of the political UN is it can only act when the great powers agree that it should act. So don't blame the UN system when the great powers can't agree. And let's not forget the operational UN, all the United Nations agencies that do invaluable work, some high profile, like its humanitarian relief in war zones, others unsung, like the World Health Organization, which has done so much to promote health and to deal with emerging pandemics, especially in Africa, and from which the Trump administration is threatening to withdraw. And the International Telecommunications Union, which sets the technical standards and the regulatory framework for the global internet. If the Trump administration trashes the UN as a whole, it will damage and undermine these valuable agencies and likely lead them to being under Chinese leadership. So what do we say as we sum all this up? Well, Donald Trump is unpredictable. That's not just a reflection of his character. He, like Richard Nixon before him, sees it as a strategic strength, keeping both friends and foes guessing about what he will do next. We should expect the unexpected. And Trump's re-election brings profound implications for Europe, including Britain. The comfortable position Europe has had since 1989, free riding on America's defense guarantee, is coming to a rapid end. America's attention is now focused on Asia, not Europe. Europeans have to stand up for themselves. And looked at objectively, who can criticize America for that? Here in Britain, Keir Starmer's government will face some important choices. Following on from this strategic analysis, defense spending needs to rise sharply, and we shall have to refocus our armed forces on our national defense. But it isn't clear where the money will come from, or if indeed the Starmer government is able to follow through on the logic of our strategic situation. The politics of moving closer to the European Union will be eased by Trump's re-election, but doing so will also mean that the space to strengthen the UK's relationship with the United States will narrow. And part of our nature as Brits is we are at home on both sides of the Atlantic. We are European by geography, history, and trade. We are part of the Anglosphere by culture, by law, and by our approach to national security. Our future, like our past, will be a mixture of both. Peter Mandelson, always ambitious for a new role or two, has talked of us having our cake and eating it with the United States and Europe. He might be right. I was surprised last month in New York to hear an official from the first Trump White House suggesting that the renewal in 2026 of the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement might allow for its expansion to include the UK and Australia. Now that seems pretty unlikely, I know, but in this unpredictable time, let's not rule things out. But in general, I think it's time for us to tighten our seatbelts and prepare for a rough 4 years ahead. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, John. We now have just 35 minutes, a good length of time for questions, both from this hall and from those watching online. I'm going to ask one question myself and then take from the audience. John, you mentioned first Trump's disinterest in giving any real help to Ukraine. I was rather surprised, unless I misheard you, that I think you said you thought it was unlikely that in the case of Taiwan, there would be an American military involvement, even if Taiwan was to be attacked by China. Is not the situation there totally different. America came into the Second World War because of what happened in the Western Pacific, the attack on Pearl Harbor. If they were to allow the Chinese to invade Taiwan and not even make an effort at the military level to respond, does that not destroy their security guarantees to Japan and South Korea in reality, even if not technically, in practice? And just to finish the point, if I may, is it not China's objective, and particularly if they were to occupy Taiwan, to effectively control the West Pacific and drive the Americans to the East Pacific as being their legitimate area of control?
Malcolm, I agree with all you say. I'm not trying to advise the Trump administration what to do. I'm just trying to predict and work out, game out what they might do. I've listened to what Donald Trump has to say on Taiwan. He thinks that the Taiwanese have stolen America's semiconductor industry. He wants that back. And once America has back the capacity to produce 80% of the world's semiconductors, which are currently made in Taiwan, what will be America's interest be in Taiwan? He says, how far away is Taiwan from the United States? 7,000 miles. How far away is Taiwan from China? 100 miles. We can't defend that, says Trump. And I think that's why I say I think the outlook for a Taiwan crisis has gone up because Xi Jinping will read this. I also don't think that China will get in their assault ships and launch their army across the Taiwan Straits. That's a very sort of Western D-Day type model as to how you, or Grenada beaches, how you sort of take over an external entity. I think what the Chinese will do is gradually tighten the screw around Taiwan. They will blockade, introduce a customs regime. They will blockade some of its energy landing sites, the LNG receiving ports. So gradually a crisis builds up like a boiling frog, and the Americans will pass the point where the frog dies. So I think that will be the Chinese strategy, and I think they will see a strategic opportunity in the next 4 years to do what Xi Jinping has said from the very outset of his leadership in China, which is to do what Mao Zedong failed to do, which was reunite the Chinese nation. Now, I think that's a very bad outcome. I think the Americans should do more. I think Joe Biden was basically right in speaking up for not just arming Taiwan, but being prepared to step in as well. What I'm saying, what I'm predicting, is that a Trump administration would not do that.
Okay, now, could you give your name before you ask your question? Gentleman with his hand up in the middle there. Microphone's coming to you.
Ali Bahajib, North-South Publications. The growing membership of the Brics, will it pose a challenge to Trump's administration, particularly to the dollar denomination in the world commodities? Thank you.
Yeah. I think there are two types of nations in the BRICS, both in the original BRICS and in the expanded BRICS. There are those who are basically fighting against American dominance, which you could include Russia and Iran in that, and to some extent China as well. And then there are countries that just don't want to be forced to choose between the West and China, and you include India and Brazil and South Africa in that basket as well. I think the BRICS is a serious entity and becoming more serious. They have a determination to make sure that they are not next in line for the sort of sanctions that we meted out against Iran and then Russia. It may be, in retrospect, taking both those countries out of SWIFT, out of the financial mechanism of SWIFT, was a warning shot too many to other countries, and they will try, as you say, to make themselves more independent of the dollar. I think there are two aspects to that. You can trade in other countries, in other currencies, at a cost, because if you're converting rupees into renminbi, it's actually cheaper to do it via the dollar. But you can do the trading as you wish, and it's a form of barter, really. But that's possible, and we're seeing much more of it. What we're not seeing is countries being prepared to put their wealth in foreign currencies like the renminbi or the ruble as a store of value. At the moment, the store of value has to be a convertible currency. And none of these countries are prepared to have a convertible currency because it undermines their control structure over their business sector and over their people. So I think there's a limit to which the Brics will be able to go in challenging the dollar, because it'll have to have convertible currencies for their alternatives to become a store of value.
Thank you. Jonathan Paris.
I'd like to ask you a question about Iran, but it's a different kind of question. You may have seen in the headlines this morning that Erwin Kotler, a jurist from Canada, was the subject, according to the Canadian police, of an assassination attempt by Iran. You already mentioned Trump's assassination attempt. And there have been European successful operations. Where does the UK stand in terms of defending this kind of aggression? And do you think perhaps under a Trump era, Iran maybe will pull back from this sort of reckless policy and be a little more cautious abroad?
Well, Ken McCullum, who is the current head of MI5, the Domestic Security Agency, has pointed out a number of times just how intensive Iranian efforts are to kill mainly critics of the Iranian regime who are here in London organising or broadcasting to undermine the regime or to weaken, at least to protest against the regime in Iran. So there is no doubt that exercising free speech and criticising Iran is met by the Iranians with attempts to kill you. Fortunately, none have been successful in this country, I don't believe, but if others know better, I'm happy to be corrected on that. I think one thing we've seen in the last several years is a weakening of Iran. And in particular, it's had this forward defense strategy of having Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, militias in Iraq and Syria as their forward defense, as they would see it. I think actually, when we look back, the killing of Qasem Soleimani had more far-reaching impacts than we thought. I thought that the Trump administration may have overstepped the mark at the time. But what his departure has done is he's removed the glue from the Iranian system. Qasem Soleimani was the man, as leader of the Quds Force, senior figure in the IRGC, who held the Supreme Leader's office and the security forces together in a unified regime. No one has replaced him. And they have no successor to Ali Khamenei, the Supreme Leader. So they are weak. That's why I say Iran is weak and vulnerable. It's on the back foot. The danger is that a weak and vulnerable country reaches for a different sort of ultimate deterrent and accelerates its nuclear program. And as soon as it does that, that's when I think we will see a much wider conflagration, which will alarm some of our friends in the region, like the Gulf countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, and indeed Turkey as well. So it's a dangerous situation in Iran, and it's coming to a turning point over the next few years.
Thank you. We have a question from Zoom now, from Jitendra Kumar Ojha. I shall read out the first part of that question. Do you think that the United Kingdom should exercise its goodwill to engage democracies in Asia and Africa to bolster their institutional capacities in the face of suspected Chinese machinations?
Well, I think that's an excellent idea. I think one of the sad developments of the last 8 years has been basically the dismantling of our overseas development effort. And part of that overseas development effort was to do precisely what Mr. Ojha is urging, that we build institutions in developing countries. It's partly because the budget has been bizarrely consumed by the cost of Ukrainian refugees in this country. Quite why Ukrainian refugee costs should be charged to the Overseas Development Ministry, I have no idea, but it was. Secondly, it was Boris Johnson's destructive act of not just merging the Development Ministry back into the Foreign Office, but actually dismantling the entire structure of DFID as it was before. So there's a big job for the Keir Starmer government to rebuild our development capability and to find the money to at least provide some element of overseas development assistance. It used to be 0.7%. David Cameron insisted on achieving that during his time as Prime Minister, which was a laudable goal. It's now, if you take out the costs of Ukrainian refugees, it's probably down to about 0.2%. I stand for correction, stand to be corrected on that, but it's a very savage cut in our effort to do precisely what Mr. Ojha is urging us to do.
Right, next please. Gentleman at the very, very back.
Thank you very much. Jukka Suukasaari, Ambassador of Finland. Sir John, you made very kind reference to the Winter War and the Finnish fight against the Soviet Union in 1939-1940. But I think if you ask the 5.5 million Finns about the applicability of the Finnish model to the crisis and the war in Ukraine, I think you would get 5.5 million no answers. And the reason for that is that we see that if that was done, that would question the whole European security architecture that has been created. It would recreate the spheres of influence, and it would not be helpful in containing Russia's expansionist power. Finland, after the Moscow Peace Treaty in 1940, was doomed to be in the grey zone between the great powers for 5 decades, and that is definitely not a fate that we hope to have for the Ukrainians. Also, the Soviet will to expand did not by any means stop in Finland, and we see saw the results then with the Soviet satellites in the Eastern Europe.
Well, that wasn't a question, but I share your concerns, Ambassador. I'm not advocating it as an ideal solution. I don't think it is ideal. I think it's very, very difficult for Ukraine, as I said, but I do not see Ukraine regaining its territory at the negotiating table. You do not regain territory at the negotiating table that you've lost on the battlefield. So there's going to be a territorial compromise. There needs to be some security guarantees. I personally would like to see Ukraine in NATO, but I don't think the Trump administration will agree to that over the next 4 years. And I think it's in our interest to find a way to seize this opportunity to end the war in Ukraine during 2025. That's all I would say. If you can find a better solution, then I'm delighted to hear it. But I think the harsh reality is that the best we can do is to try to pause things where we are now and wait until a successor leadership to Putin, in the same way that Finland waited for a successor leadership to Stalin, to emerge with whom you can have a different sort of dialogue.
Thank you. Yes, Lord Howe.
Just coming.
Thanks so much. David Howe in the House of Lords. John, you talked about predictions, and you talked about the glue keeping nations together in the age of populism. Populism from the left and from the right as well. Different sorts, but both driven by high connectivity and the microchip, which has changed the entire way the world works. Do you think that, what is the next step in this enormous upheaval in the whole of human existence? Are we in an age of the new enlightenment, of the end of the printing press, the steam age, the industrial revolution? Is this a giant shift in human conditions, or is it just a slight bump in the path of progress? And if we all hang in there tight, things will come back to normal. Because where you start on that big question depends on where you go next.
Well, thank you, David. That's a thoughtful question. And my belief, after talking to many of the big figures in Silicon Valley, is that it is more of a revolution that we're facing rather than just a bump in the road. It is like the printing press moment, like the discovery of electricity. It is going to be transformative what these new technologies will bring. And like the printing press and electricity, it will be 90% really good, really valuable to human development. It will make us in more control of our lives, of our health. We'll develop new materials. We'll have deeper understanding than we've ever had before. But 10% of it is dangerous. And I think one of the best things that Rishi Sunak did during his brief time as Prime Minister was convene the Bletchley Park Summit and bring the Americans and the Chinese into the same room together to talk about the dangers to our safety from artificial intelligence, which are about autonomous weapons, they're about biological toxins and so on. So there's a range of new threats there, which only by cooperation can we reach some form of agreement. And it was interesting in the weekend meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in Lima, that they did agree that the two countries would ensure there was a human decision-making in the loop in any situation of firing weapons. That's the sort of simple step that a commitment at the high level will be helpful as we go forward, but it's going to need to be worked through in much greater detail at lower levels. So artificial intelligence, yes, a huge revolution in our lives. It may not affect those of our generation as much as it does our children and our children's children. 90% good, 10% very dangerous, and that has to be managed.
Thank you. A question from Zoom, Thelma Matuk. You mentioned that Trump is unlikely to focus on the Palestinian cause. What can the UK do in bringing this important cause of a two-state Palestinian solution to the top of Trump's agenda?
Well, I think you're asking for too much there, Ms. Matuk. I don't think we will be able to bring it to the top of his agenda. I think the goal for those of us who believe that a Palestinian state is an essential part of a stable Middle East is to keep it on the agenda at all. My own view is that the country that most badly needs a Palestinian state is Israel, because it's only with a two-state solution that the state of Israel will live in enduring peace and stability. But it is a challenge, and after the experiences that the Israelis have been through over the last year, you can't blame them for questioning that opportunity, that path. I think we can do more. I think your question points at something that was in the Labour Party manifesto of the last election, which is whether the UK should recognise an independent Palestinian state now and support its membership of the UN, like some 150 other countries have done. I'm always a bit nervous about doing things in international politics which are at risk of being a gesture. But I do think that if we believe in Palestinian sovereignty and we believe in that a two-state solution is the right outcome, then recognizing that there is the beginnings of a Palestinian state, I think will be an important step to be taken. And it's interesting that David Lammy and Keir Starmer's government have said, a bit like St. Augustine, yes, we will do that, but not yet. But let's see if that moves forward. It might do, and I think there'll be a case for doing it, but people have to be persuaded that something has changed in order to justify that recognition. I think the bigger thing we can do is to try to discourage President Trump from allowing Israel to expel large numbers of Palestinians from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip, and to recognize new annexations, as he did in his first term with the annexation of the Golan Heights, recognized by America, and recognizing East Jerusalem as part of a unified Israeli capital. So there are steps that we can take, but as I didn't go into detail on the Palestinian question because I don't think we can do much more than hold the line, and even that is an uphill struggle over the next 4 years.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Michael Binion from the Times. How much do you think that President Trump's...
We take the microphone.
Oh, I'm so sorry, yes. How much do you think President Trump's somewhat bizarre appointments are a defiant gesture intended to just undermine and wrong foot his enemies? And how much do you think they will somehow be replaced, or at least edged out of position, by pragmatists who perhaps might have a different idea, perhaps, over how the health ministry should be run?
Well,
for example, yes, among others.
Until about a week ago, Trump's appointments weren't bad. He appointed a very capable chief of staff in Susie Wiles. He's national security advisor. We may not agree with everything he says, but he's a very capable individual. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is a very credible Secretary of State. But the wackos came in a week ago at Defense, at the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence, none of whom are plausible candidates for serious jobs in an administration. I think one of the interesting moves in American politics was the election of Senator John Thune, the senator from South Dakota, as the new Senate Majority Leader. He will have to find a modus vivendi with Trump. I think some of these candidates will be knocked out by their It's surprising how many of these testosterone-charged males have got a record of sexual abuse. But that seems to be coming out now in some of these nominations. I think some of them will be weeded out just by that pressure. I think Trump yesterday said something privately that suggested he knows that Matt Gaetz is not going to survive as the candidate to be Attorney General. And the Senate doesn't need many more senators to dissent from a nomination in order to block it with the Democrats who will surely vote against these sorts of people. So I think at the end of the day, you know, Churchill's old maximum, at the end of the day, the Americans will always do the right thing, but only after trying all the available alternatives. Well, Trump is happy to try the available alternatives, and he'll be very happy, I think, in order to be able to say, look, the deep state is frustrating me, the deep state is trying to undermine me, the Washington swamp is getting in my way. So he will use it politically, as well as being probably relieved he doesn't have some of the people he's nominated from Fox Television in his cabinet room.
Lord Herney.
You've danced around the relationship between this country and the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
Could you have a shot at both the idea of a security pact with the EU and the reset which the present government is starting to shape up?
Well, I think this government has had two problems in its first 4 or 5 months. First of all, it constrained itself too tightly in its manifesto, perhaps learning the lesson from Theresa May's experience in 2017. And secondly, it wasn't really prepared for government. It had a lot of bumper stickers, but it didn't have a clear plan as to what it was going to do in any of these areas. So I think there is a chance for reflection. As I said in my remarks, I think the election of Trump will actually ease the politics of a closer closer EU-UK relationship, and I welcome that. I think the key element there is going to be finding a way to ease the trade restrictions. There are things which both sides can do on that. You know more about this, David, than I do, but all the phytosanitary and the veterinary agreements are fairly easy. They're low-hanging fruit, I would have thought, in this area. On the scope for a EU-UK security pact, security agreement, there's certainly scope there. I think it was probably wise to not to have gone down that road and traded it off for nothing when we first did the agreement on Brexit. But there's an opportunity now to add that into the mix. Whatever the outcome is on Ukraine, and I hear clearly and share the concerns of our Finnish ambassador friend about what the outcome on Ukraine might mean for wider European security. There's no doubt that Britain and France are going to be the crucial players in Europe's defence and security structures. Our intelligence agencies are under huge demand and encouragement from European partners to help them with their domestic security, dealing with things like infiltration, Iranian and Chinese intelligence penetration, and so on. So there's a lot that the UK has to offer. I think on the European side, they do need to think a bit more constructively about how this relationship works for the UK. There are simple things. I flew to Brussels the other day and spent an hour in the immigration queue with Arabs and Africans waiting to get into Belgium. That's a very easy thing for the EU to change, and it would make people like me very happy. I think there are other things which are fairly straightforward in terms of easing some of the trade restrictions. It probably will require us to do some dynamic following of EU regulation and accept on the EU side that there's going to be regulations from the European Court of Justice, decisions from the European Court of Justice, which will have an impact on us as well. So there's lots of space here. You know much more about the detail than probably anybody else in this room. I think the direction of travel is right. I think Keir Starmer has invested in these relationships. He might need to invest in a relationship with the new German Chancellor in a few months' time. But I think he started off doing the right thing. We now need to fill in the gaps, and there needs to be some reciprocity on the EU side, as well as give from our side on the trade and security, on the security and defence side.
Thank you. Christina Lamb.
Thank you. I was beginning to think only men could ask questions.
I was thinking that as well, so I'm glad to have you here, Christina.
So, I wanted to ask you, Sir John, about two things that you didn't mention that only a few years ago probably would have been top of the agenda, and that's Afghanistan and international terrorism. Weirdly, one group of people who I was in contact with who were happy about Trump's election were women in Afghanistan because they felt things couldn't be worse than they are under the Biden administration. So I wonder if you think there is something somehow Trump could do about this country where girls can't go to high school and women can't work. And the other question was about international terrorism, about ISIS in particular. We don't seem to be speaking about it very much. I travelled quite a lot recently in Iraq and northeast Syria. People there are very concerned about all the sleeper cells, about that whole camp where you've got like 60,000 ISIS people, and whether we should be doing more about that.
Yeah. I did mention Afghanistan mainly to be rude about President Biden's withdrawal from that country, which has had the very bad effect that you have described and was unnecessary for the Americans to do that and forced European contingents, including our own, to withdraw as well. A bit like our friend who asked the question about the Palestinians, I can't see Afghanistan going back up the priority list for a Trump administration. I think we are looking there to UN agencies, to neighboring countries, including those who have connections into Afghanistan, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Pakistanis maybe, to try to moderate some of the behaviors of the Taliban regime and to allow some normalcy for women's education and women's life to be at least partly re-established. But I'm afraid, Christina, I wouldn't look to the Trump administration to take the lead on that. I think we'll have to do it despite the Americans rather than in the wake of American leadership. And actually, I think the work of NGOs, I've talked to people like the Turquoise Mountain and to David Miliband's IRC, all of whom are trying to do work in Afghanistan. And if they keep below a certain level of profile, they're able to carry on with their humanitarian education work. It's when they get above a certain level of profile that problems are caused with the ideologues in the Taliban. On terrorism, I agree, 10 years ago, that was when I was chief of MI6, that was the highest concern we had. We had the London Olympics. The greatest triumph for me of the London Olympics was the London Olympics was terrorism-free. And we and MI5 worked incredibly closely together with our foreign partners to ensure that outcome. I did warn in the Financial Times recently that the developments in Gaza and in Lebanon, when you decapitate a seasoned leadership of a terrorist organization like Hamas and Hezbollah, that they may turn to just pure blooded violence of the IS, of the Islamic State type. And I think there is a risk that the terrorism which we've tended over the last, touch wood hard, over the last 5 years, we've not seen much international terrorism with an Islamic driving cause behind it. We may see that come back if the countries around Israel are unable to organize themselves in some form of satisfactory way. Refugees is a big part of that. You're seeing a lot of refugees being encouraged to go back to Syria. Now, I don't quite know what the effect of all that is going to be, but I certainly don't think we should completely take our eye off this ball, and I know that my successors in the service and their counterparts in MI5 are not doing so.
Next question will be from Michael's daughter, Mary.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about why, after 35 years, America's abandoning Europe support for China.
Why America?
You said after having since 1989, we've always been a sort of team, and why they're leaving us and choosing China to team up with.
Well, I think the transatlantic relationship was central because of the legacy of the Second World War and because of the history of the Cold War, where the Soviet-American rivalry and tension was the defining feature of the world for 50 years. I think the defining feature for the next 40 or 50 years will be the rivalry between the United States and China. China aspires to be the world's greatest economy, to be at least as big a power. As Malcolm said in his question to me, part of China's goal is to push America out of being the most powerful country in East Asia. If you were Chinese, you could see that as a reasonable goal. If you're sitting in the Philippines or Japan or Vietnam, you do not want that to happen. So I think the defining feature for the next 50 years is going to be the US-China relationship, and Europe is going to be left to the Europeans to sort out, and that will probably include taking the great burden of managing the ongoing threat from Russia, which we heard so clearly spoken by our Finnish friend.
Thank you. Time for probably two more questions, I think. Lady here. Please, use the microphone, please. Thank you.
Is there a big priority for UK at present, as it is holding the presidency of the Security Council?
The presidency of the Security Council gives you a high profile but not much influence. Having been president of the Security Council, I know what it's like. So I don't think it gives us a great deal of opportunity other than to organise the occasional special meeting, as David Lammy did, I think it was yesterday, when he chaired a meeting to mark the 1,000 days of warfare in Ukraine and put the Russians on the spot. I mean, I think, as I said in my remarks about the United Nations, the Security Council cannot function unless there's agreement between the great powers. And although Britain and France are part of the P5, we tend to be the secretariat of the P5. We tend to keep the UN system, Security Council system going rather than there as a sort of veto-wielding power. So you have to have America, China, and Russia on board for the Security Council to be effective. It still does things in parts of Africa, parts of South Asia. It's in the Security Council, but the great value of the UN system now is the specialized agencies, and we really must do everything we can to keep those specialized agencies in place, and being effective.
Thank you. Yes, a gentleman with his hand up. Yes, thank you. Final question.
William Wallace. Is the Trump administration likely to push the UK to choose America first rather than Europe first? We've had various comments and articles on this within the last week, including from people close to President Trump. And I assume that the establishment here will want, as always, to balance Britain between Europe and the United States and to avoid any sort of exclusive choice of one over the other. How do we manage that?
Well, William, I tried to address that question in my closing remarks about us having being comfortable on both sides of the Atlantic, our past being a mix of being part of the Anglosphere and part of Europe, and I think our future will be as well. I suspect that my successors in the Foreign Office, in Number 10, in MI6, will be encouraging Keir Starmer and his ministers to look for the best of both worlds. I think Peter Mandelson captured that in his remark. I think there is opportunity to get something out of the Trump administration. I painted a pretty bleak picture of the Trump administration in the world, but Trump does have the occasional soft spot. He had a Scottish mother, and he doesn't view Britain in the same way as he does the European Union. I think it's a stretch to think that we would be part of a newly fashioned North American free trade agreement, but I do think there are areas where we may not be in the firing line in the way that France and Germany will be in the period ahead. So there's something there to work on. At the same time, we are geographically, security-wise, part of Europe. And I think there is more prospect for us to make progress in a systematic way with the European Union than there is probably with the United States. But it will be important. I think we've probably only had one prime minister in the last 50 years who's been as equally comfortable in the transatlantic relationship as he was in the European relationship, and that was Tony Blair. Whether Keir Starmer can re-establish that sort of balance and outlook, I don't know, but I wish him well.
My notes as the chairman tell me that we have to finish at 2 p.m. on the dot, as that was one of the things that Michael felt most strongly about. So I cannot possibly contradict that. John, can I thank you most warmly both for your initial remarks and also the extraordinary way in which you have been able to handle a whole series of questions, none of which you knew in advance, and have been able to give so much information as well as opinion in the answers that you've given. Michael would be proud of the fact that he initiated this meeting, and I think we are all in your debt today. So if you could join with me in thanking you.